Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Beyond the DRA, Cloud Label Printing. My name is Sohaib and I will be your moderator today along with Nicole, Joyce. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Ashley Desiongco, Senior Solution Architect, and Bostjan Golob, Principal Software Engineer. Ashley, over to you to get us started.
All right, thank you, Sohaib. Let's get started with our agenda. Today, we'll cover what's new with label printing in D365, an overview of the cloud label printing feature, which is the main topic for today, the relevant use cases to help determine when cloud label printing is a suitable option versus the DRA, a demo of the configuration and features in action, and finally, some time at the end for live Q&A, but as Sohaib mentioned, feel free to submit your question to the chat at any time. All right, before we get into today's main topic, the cloud label printing, I'd like to first summarize a few relatively new features related to label printing. Some of these have already been covered in our What's New Tech Talks, but I'd like to reiterate some of these just to set the foundation for this presentation. So first, let's start with label layouts. And these are an option for customers to use in place of document routing layouts. The document routing layout form is not deprecated, but there's now a choice for customers to use these or the new label layouts. Label layouts are a requirement for using cloud label printing, so keep this in mind throughout the rest of the presentation. We're about to look at the form in more depth, but before I do, I wanted to call out that this is driven by a parameter on the warehouse management parameters. Okay, so label layouts allow for the use of variables in the design of your labels. This is also needed for the cloud label printing, as the label file designed in the external service, like Bartender or Nice Label, which we'll see later, can be defined as a variable in F&O. Label layouts also offer additional flexibility, like using label templates, which allows you to build more advanced label layouts with repeating structures or headers, body, and footer elements. Next, let's talk about custom labels. Label layouts enabled us to support the creation of custom labels as well. And this feature allows you to build layouts from a variety of data sources. For example, containers, locations, and products. After you define the data sources, you can then leverage the fields on those tables in the label layout forms. To print these custom labels, you can display custom label print buttons on the relevant forms by enabling the parameter in warehouse management parameters. Once you enable that, you'll then see the buttons show up in the Options tab on the various forms like so. Next, let's talk about dynamic printer selection. With all these new enhancements to the label printing process, we've also introduced a new form to define label printer setup. And this is separate from network printers, as we need a way to define cloud label printers that are not on the network. To use both dynamic printer selection and cloud label printing, your label printers need to be defined in this form. We've also added the ability to define default label printers for warehouse workers and locations. And this is especially useful if you leverage those mobile belt printers for warehouse workers, or for locations, if you have a dedicated printer for locations like packing stations, you can set those up as defaults. So what's so dynamic about this feature? Well, with the ability to define default printers comes the ability to override those defaults. So for that, a new indirect mobile device menu item has been introduced to allow app users to override the label printer on the fly as needed. And on the left, you'll see a preview of what that menu item looks like in the Warehouse mobile app. All right, now that we've recapped some of those features, let's get into the main event. So starting quickly with a refresher, here's how label printing works via the document routing agent. And you'll hear me refer to this as the DRA for short. So before the release of the cloud label printing capabilities in the 10.0.34 update last June, this was the only out-of-the-box option to manage labels and printing in the warehouse. The cloud label printing feature did not replace this, as both can be leveraged in the system, and later we'll talk about use cases to determine which configuration is best for which scenarios. All right, so with the DRA, labels are defined as document routing layouts. And these are written in ZPL, unlike what we saw in the label layouts for, where we have options to use variables or templates. These document routing layouts are then mapped to a work order type and associated printer via the document routing setup. When print steps are initiated in D365 or the warehouse management app, the job will be sent to the DRA, which is installed on-prem, which in turn dispatches the job to the appropriate printer. Okay, so let's see how this differs from printing via an external service. So here we'll notice there are a few differences in the setup. The first is instead of document routing layouts being the source of the label design, these external services use those label layouts to define the label design. So those are the forms we looked at earlier. The next difference is the need to define the external service and its operations. And you'll see this in the demo later. Bostjan will show you how this is configured. The next and biggest difference is how the print jobs make it over to the printers. These print jobs are communicated to the external service via HTTP API calls. Some examples of external service providers who we've seen customers implement are Bartender Cloud and Loftware Nice Label. Admins can also review the external service request log to view the requests that have been sent to the service in case they need to troubleshoot any issues. And finally, instead of an on-prem DRA to manage traffic to the printers, an on-prem component of the label service may be defined. And again, as we saw earlier, the cloud printers need to be defined in that label printer form as opposed to being defined as a network printer. Okay, so let's dive into some of the use cases. So when is it more appropriate to configure cloud label printing through an external service or use the DRA? So this is not one size fits all, but for many organizations, they can benefit from using the DRA. It's a cost-effective option with a relatively simple infrastructure. If your customer does not already use an external labeling service and is conscientious of budget, then implementing the DRA is a good approach. The downside of this approach is that you may have scalability considerations down the road as the organization expands. You need to ensure that the DRA service can keep up with the printing demand and number of printers. The other downside is the limitation in label design. While the introduction of those label layouts gives organizations the ability to use variables and templates, like we saw earlier, the simplicity of using a label designer with drag and drop capabilities like those available in Bartender or Nice Label is unmatched. And you'll see what this looks like in the demo a little bit later. Now, on the other hand, if a customer has complex, specialized label requirements and has extensive printing demand, cloud label printing is the way to go. The downfall here is that the service comes at an additional cost through the service provider, not through Microsoft, and also introduces some architectural considerations that should be taken into account by the project team during implementation. For example, making sure it's included in integration, planning, testing, etc. Of course, every organization is unique, and these use cases are not one size fits all. And that's why we're providing the flexibility in D365 to use either approach. All right, well, now I'm going to hand it over to Bostjan to demo how to configure and use these cloud label printing features. Bostjan, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. So I have prepared 3 blocks of demos for this session. First, we'll take a look at using the Loftware Cloud integrated with F&O. This is one of the 2 solutions that we have documented integrations with within our documentation. Then we'll go through an overview of the setup itself and see how these parameters then shape the calls that we make to external services. This is extremely useful if you want to integrate with one of a number of different labeling solutions that we may not have documented before. So you will have to do the configuration yourself. And finally, I'll also show the second of the 2 documented integrations. Well, with a slight twist, it will be using the Bartender API, but I will be showing it as an on-prem integration instead of the cloud integration. So we have the cloud documented. I just decided to make it slightly more interesting and show you how you could also integrate an on-prem labeling solution to the cloud F&O. Okay, with that, let's start with the Loftware cloud integration. So if you have not seen any labeling solution so far, Loftware is a good example to start with because it has all of the main components of what the labeling solution does. So a labeling solution obviously will manage printers because label printers are kind of special. They're not completely the same as ordinary printers, so there are special settings like label sizes and so on that need to be managed. So oftentimes these labeling solutions will have some sort of printer management. A Loftware can handle both on-prem printers and what they call cloud printers. These are printers that can connect directly to the cloud without having any on-prem components. And for the demos today, we will be using this printer called Zebra ZD620, which is sitting on my desk at the office, connected just to our corporate Wi-Fi and to the cloud. So there's no DRA or any equivalent of that sitting anywhere to be able to print. In addition to just managing the printers, another thing that these solutions often provide is extensive history and analytics, and of course alerting if a printer runs out of stock, if a printer is offline, and so on. And then how many prints you've made, which labels get printed to which printers, and so on. And finally, both of the two that we have documented and a lot of others that I've seen come with some sort of document storage as well, typically with workflow versioning capabilities as well. This is due to various regulated industries like life sciences, pharmaceuticals, and so on, or hazardous materials, where there needs to be a nice audit trail of all the changes to any labeling. So for this demonstration today, I will start with a simple license plate label that I created. And it initially has, so I'll be using the editor that comes with the Loftware solution. Initially, I just put in a barcode for the license plate ID and a placeholder for an item. So, these barcode the barcode is connected to a data source variable called license plate ID, which I'll show now. So the label itself has two variables, license plate ID and item identification, and I will just add another one for the quantity, just to show you how if you want to add a field and you have an external labeling solution, you do not usually need to fight with ZPL to get that field on. You can usually just drag and drop these things. So here I'm just defining QTY as a new variable, then I'm creating some text, positioning it, and adding the quantity value as well. And connecting it, of course, to the new variable. So we have these three variables that will need to set up later. Just skip over in the interest of time. So this is how a label will actually look like. And if you trust me that when I push this print, the label actually came out of the printer on my desk. The last thing that we need to do here is, again, I talked about those compliance and so on. So we'll just check in this change. And as the last thing, we will note this path here because we will also need this when we do the setup later. Okay, changing gears and going over to the F&O side of the setup, I will be following our guidance for setting up this integration. As I said, we will be using a cloud printer. Loftware has two different APIs depending on whether you're using printers that have this cloud printing capability or you're using on-prem printers through an integration manager that's installed locally. But today I will be using this Cloud Print API. So there's a little bit of setup that needs to be done on the nice label side, but that's linked as well, and it's relatively easy to follow. So going to F&O configuration, I followed the steps in the documentation and created an external service definition NL print for the Cloud Print API. It has two operations, one that sends a raw ZPL if you want to print that, for example, for carrier labels, and the other operation is for variable print. So this is the operation that we'll be using to print out that label that I just showed you. And we'll go into much more details about what's the print operation and variable print operation later. After setting up the definition, we need to set up the instance. Again, following the instructions in the documentation, I created an external service instance, and the documentation tells you exactly what to put in all of these fields, including how to get this authentication secret. Finally, I decided to just log everything here. So we have an option to log successes and failures. Here, I'll just log everything for now. We'll get to that in more detail later. So this is all of the guidance that is documented done. We're now left with two additional pieces of setup that are specific for external label printing, and then one which is, document routing that's universal for all sorts of printing. So I will create a new label printer, and here I will set up that it's external label service. I will give it an internal name, so this name is for purposes within F&O. And I will set it up that it's connected to a label print service instant NL print, the one that I just created. And within this NL print, so the Loftware cloud, the printer is called Zebra ZD620. We saw that in one of the first forms. That's all we need to set up for the label printers. Now we need to create a representation of that label that I edited previously within F&O. And to do that, I will create a new license plate label layout, and I call it NL license plate. I will use the new definition type variables, and because I need to put in some numbers, I will do this date, time, and number format, and I set it to NUS just to make sure that the numbers are formatted with a decimal dot instead of a decimal comma that would be usual for my setup here in Europe. So every variable layout comes with two system variables. So these two variables are kind of special. One is called the label file, and this one is used to specify the path to the file within the storage system of the external label solution, and the quantity, which is the quantity of labels to be printed. In addition to the two system variables, we will then add additional data variables as required by the specific label. So here I copied the path from the label that we had before, and now I will specify the variables from the label. So the license plate ID, and if you've ever worked with label layouts or document routing layouts, you know that we substitute values by using these $ and then the name of the field, the $ replacement markers. So the variable name license plate ID maps to license plate ID, item identification to item ID, and quantity I will add by using the insert field reference from the list of fields. This is if you don't know the names of all of these fields, you can just select the field from here and do insert field reference. The thing that's left for me to do here on the quantity is to set what's called a format string. These are also explained on our documentation. This is to make sure that the quantity field is formatted as a number. So this is 0.00 just makes things format as a number. And then this will use the format of the language setup up here, which is NUS with the decimal dot. Okay, with all of this set up, this is just me making sure everything is saved. We go to document routing and set up that when I will be receiving a purchase order, we create a license plate label and we print the label layout and a license plate to the printer LN Cloud Zebra. So save all of this, go to the emulator. I have one PO set up to receiving. And again, unfortunately, you don't see my printer. This now printed out a label, but what I can show you is here in the log, you can see that last row with a success response to a 1 means success. And the nice label said it was able to print this. And if I go to request details, I can also see the exact comment that was sent. This is a JSON, a so-called JSON format, and it tells the system to print the label, if you see from the file path with these variables, to the cloud printer called Zebra ZD620. Okay, and with that concludes the first demo, which is the use of Loftware. So these labeling solutions, of course, support all sorts of other features, both Loftware and Bartender. I have scratched very, very thinly on the surface about the capabilities of these solutions. Okay, so next demo will be about basically an overview or in-depth overview of the configuration starting from scratch. So what if you want to use a service that isn't one of the two that we have documentation about? Well, we'll start with, as the documentation starts with the external service definition. The external service definition basically tells the system how a service needs to be called. So we first give it a name and a description, and we need to specify at least one service operation. In order to configure the service operation, you will need to have the specifications of the API for the external labeling service. We support external labeling services that can be reached via HTTP calls. So if it only supports TCP ports, there might be something you could do and try to parse out the details from the request, but in general, we really prefer if the service talks natively HTTP. But as far as how the request needs to be formatted, you have actually a lot of leverage here. So here we'll start with defining a print operation. So this isn't a specific third party. I'm just showing a sample of this configuration. So the first thing we set up is the HTTP method. Typically, this will be post for any operations that kind of send data. After selecting the method, we select the relative URL. So this is this part of the URL that's after the host name, right? So after the first slash, let's call it print. Again, this should be in the documentation for the API you want to connect to. We put in the operation timeout. This is how long the system will wait for a response from the service before continuing. We want to put this to some reasonably low values so that we still get a result if possible. Otherwise, we will mark the request as non-fatal error. That makes sense. It's basically, it just gets marked that there a timeout expired, but there isn't actually an error coming back from the labeling service. The warehouse workers will have to wait at most this time, and it's in milliseconds, so 1,000 basically means we give the service 1 second to respond. 1 to 2 seconds is what I would say is a nice configuration. 3 or more might start impacting the experience if the service is that slow. Just a note, even if the timeout occurs, that doesn't mean that the call on the service will be terminated. It just means that it will be marked as timed out on our side. So it can still process and still print the labels. Okay. Finally, on this general, we need to select what kind of a body we'll be using, form data or raw. If the service requires a JSON or an XML file or plain data, then typically we'll be using raw. If it needs form data, it will say it needs form data. So for my examples, I will be using raw as the body type. Next thing that you can configure is a query string. So query strings are these things in the URL after the question signs. Typically, in here, you would have either shared secret keys or maybe printer names. Really depends on the API. Some people like to put this configuration here, but again, the API specification will tell you where to put the printer. In this case, I'm just, for demo purposes, creating a query string parameter that says printer, and we will substitute this printer with this special substitution value called label.printer, so $label.printer. And when the service call is created, this label.printer placeholder will be replaced by the external name of the printer selected. So in the previous example with nice label, if you remember, we used Zebra ZD620 here. Then we can specify HTTP headers. This is, again, something that the API documentation will say if it needs to put in. The most famous of the headers is the authorization header, where authentication information, so passwords, shared keys, would be put in. So I will just create an X- authorization header, and I will put in the second of the 3 special replacement keys. This one is called $auth.secret. This auth.secret is specified on an external service instance later as the password or some sort of a secret that FNO will use to authenticate to the labeling service. And then finally, in the request body, because we selected this raw body, we have two fields to configure. One is the content type. This tells the service being called what kind of data it gets in the parameter, in the body of the message. Typically, this will be text XML, text JSON, or something like that. In here, because I will be just putting plain ZPL, I will use text plain. But again, this should be in the documentation for the API. So I'll set text plain, and in the request body, let me just back up a bit. I will put in some text, label body follows, and then put the third of the special replacement keys called $label.body. In the case of a label defined with ZPL, this label.body will be the ZPL itself. And you will see that in a moment, how that's. So this is now a very simple print operation. And what's left for us is to go back to the service definition and specify that the print operation will be this new operation called print that we just created. So whenever the system needs to call the external service to print a label defined as a ZPL, it will use this operation to do the job. We will later look at the variables print operation and how to use that. Okay, After we've done with the definition, we need to specify at least one external service instance for this definition. So if you have multiple servers, for example, Bartender Cloud has a different cloud URL for the Americas, for Europe, and so on. You could use the same definition for multiple instances and then connect the printers to different instances. So here I will create a new instance for my new service definition. And since I don't have an actual service, I will use this website called Request Bin. No special I don't want to make some special promotion about this site. It's just a very convenient site because you can push this public bin link down here, and it basically creates a URL that you can send requests to, and it will show you what you've sent to. So it's useful for testing because it just shows. Obviously, do not send any customer data to these kinds of public endpoints, but if you want to do some testing, troubleshooting, feel free to do so using this one or any of. There are several other similar services. So I will just use this service as the base URL. So I'll create a new. I will call it RB1 for request bin 1. Select the external label service that I just created. And set it to send the request to this URL that we just saw. And then we don't need any authentication in this case, so I'll just put something in the authentication secret, so we'll see later how that happens. Now for logging, I will create successes. I will set it up as successes and errors, but for production use, typically we would have less than that. We should have something like perhaps only logging errors and then log request bodies, either none or only errors, depending. Successes, we probably don't need to log. Just be careful if you have that timeout set to too low for the service to actually get a chance to respond. You will have errors, even though they're not fatal. So with all of this set up, let's go and create a printer. So this printer is basically, the setup is the same as we did before with nice labels. So let me just skip a little bit. So we have printer 1 connected to this service RB1, and I will just use printer 1 as the label print service printer name as well. I will not be very creative here. So I'll use the same one, but it doesn't need to be. Okay. For the label layout, I will just use the license plate that is in our demo data that has the license plate ID, item ID, and quantity replacement. And again, I'll configure this on the purchase order. So this time I will say print to printer 1, the license plate label layout. And I will use the emulator as before to receive some inventory. And as I confirm this, the license plate label will be generated, and then the printing job will be sent to request bin. So if I look here, we got this request, and we can now kind of see how the setup in the definition corresponds to this request. So the post corresponds to the method that we used, the print. I just open this definition again. So post corresponds to the post operation, and then the /print corresponds to the relative URL. And then we have the query string parameter printer. You see that it has been replaced by printer 1. Then expanding the headers, we have the x-authorization headers and a secret that I put in here. So this corresponds to this configuration that I'm pointing out now. And finally, the request body, the most important part, is its text plain. And then we have the label body follows and the ZPL. So one very convenient use of basically request bin is if you're configuring a system and you don't want to spend time setting up a DRA and then having a virtual ZPL printer or something, you can just use a request bin or a similar service to send you the ZPL, and then you can copy the ZPL into labelary, which has a preview function for ZPL, and then you can kind of see if this is what you expect to get. So even if you do not have an actual external label printing service, but plan to leverage the DRA for production printing, you can still use this one as a kind of shortcut when testing. Okay, so this is basically the configuration for these ZPL style prints. But what happens if we want to print, if we actually have an external label printing service that corresponds to a Loftware or Bartender-like solution? For them, we wouldn't be really sending ZPL, right? That kind of defeats the purpose of an external labeling solution. So we want to send variables instead. So in order to do that, we need to define a variables print operation. And to make things slightly more realistic, or that you can understand maybe better, imagine that we have a solution that requires this kind of an XML as input. So for it to print out a label, it needs an XML that has one element that says printer, and then the printer name in it, label, and the label name in it, quantity with the quantity in it, and then variables and repeating variable name, and then the value here. Right? And if it gets this kind of input, it will print, it will create the label and print it. So how do we use the configuration of external service definitions to generate this kind of XML? So the job will be split between two pieces of setup. So one field will be the request body on the operation, and the second part will be inside this variable label layout template. So you've seen before that we have the label.printer replacement variable within the operation. So this is exactly the part that we will actually take out of this example and put in there. So let's get configuring. So I will copy the whole thing and start creating a new operation. So I will create a new operation, print XML. Kind of setup will be similar. So post 1000, print XML, request headers. So here's now the interesting part, right? The content type will be text XML to specify that we'll be printing XML. Then we will use the label printer replacement here, take the rest out, and use the label body here. So the label body in this case will be translated in two steps, with one of the steps being this label layout template. So coming back, I will specify the print operation to be this print XML, and I remove the parts that were already specified in the operation. So now I only need to do this label part. So here, what I will do is I will use the special system variables.label file, placeholder for the label file, and the system variables.quantity for the quantity. And then for the repeating variables, I will use the template expression for repeating rows. If you're not familiar with them, this is, you can look it up in the documentation, how to get repeating rows. So here we repeat over all of the variables and then put the name in this attribute called name. So we're using the replacement placeholder label layout variable dot variable, and then the value is dollar label layout variable dot value. And this is all of the setup that we need. So I will then use the label layout that I already have for my Bartender demo. So it is a label that has a label file, simple license plate, and has 2 data variables. I'll just add a new variable. So nothing you'll see in the XML. And then here in the document routing printers, I will again use the printer 1, which is connected to the request bin. But now I will use the label layout that is defined using a variable. So now the system will know to use the variable print operation when I do the print. So again, receiving some inventory. And now I have a print XML operation. And as you can see, we got the XML as expected. So the printer has been replaced with printer 1, label, the value of the label variable has been placed in here, quantity, and then for the 2 variables, the item ID and the license plate ID, the values are in here. And this is how you can define your own external service definition and then an instance to connect to a labeling solution that we might not have documented before. And finally, I will try to fly through this one so you have some time for questions. Is an integration with Bartender. That's a nice label or a Loftware we've already taken a look at. The other solution that we have documented integration with is Bartender Cloud. As I said, I will be showing off the integration with Bartender on premises instead, just to spice things up a bit. The reason why we do not document the on-prem integration is because of the way how to expose the server to the internet is basically up to you and your IT. So you, in cooperation with your IT, needs to figure out a way how to expose these servers to the public internet, because F&O can only call services that are accessible via the public internet. As Microsoft, we have options such as API management or application gateways or logic apps with on-prem connectors. Many options just for Microsoft. You could even use your firewall to open up this server as well. Or you can use the solution that, or a similar solution to what I'll be using here, which is ngrok, which is a very simple little utility that can kind of expose a server to the public internet. But yes, this is the main reason why we do not document this. So what I did here to configure this integration is I just installed Bartender. That's beyond this demo. Then I configured the use of basic authentication and HTTPS for the Bartender API. The reason why we can do this is because the Bartender on-prem and cloud actually use extremely similar APIs. So we can use the documentation for the cloud as a starting point to get the configuration of the on-prem going. After I've configured the Bartender, I've created a new user on Windows, and then I created an authentication secret out of the username and password by using PowerShell. this is because this is how basic authentication stores data. So you put in the username and password, and then you get a funny string out. You save this, and then use that as the authentication secret later. Next thing is I set up ngrok. So ngrok is a utility, ngrok.com. Again, no, actually, is an endorsement or anything. It's just the utility that I use. And with some setup, we basically need to expose the port 5159 of the Bartender server to the public internet. So I will have that running here. It exposes my port to this. So you see localhost 5159. This is the Bartender, and the public site will be this HTTPS 172.1. I will copy this and put it into the instance. I'm sorry, I'm speeding up just so again you will have some time for Q&A later. So the next thing is within Bartender, we must create a new or modify a license plate. So a label to print. So here's a license plate label. Again, I have a very simple one with just an item and a license plate ID. The only difference here, conceptually, it's basically similar to what we did previously in Loftware. The only thing is that Bartender calls these named data sources, not variables. But the named data sources here will be used in the definition of the label layout later. And the Bartender librarian is the place where labels are stored. So I need to take this lib path here to know where the label is stored. So going back to the external service definition, I basically followed the setup that is published for the cloud solution, and I did only 2 changes to it. And I just fast forward to show you these changes. One is in the authorization. I use this basic word here instead of bearer. This just means that we use basic authentication so that the out secret is that username and password thing. And the other thing is that needs to be changed is in the label print service, this variable template. In the documentation, the document file path starts with librarian, and then main and system variables. That main part is not necessary for the on-prem solution. But otherwise, the setup is exactly the same as for the cloud solution. So going forward, I created an external service instance with this ngrok's URL and the authentication secret that I mentioned before. Again, created a label printer with this name corresponding to the name of the printer that is on the server. And then we have a label layout with this simple license plate, BTW name, and the item ID and license plate ID. So variable name corresponding to the named data sources. Finally, documents routing like before, receiving some data. And in this case, I have the prints redirected not to a printer, but to files. And this is, I open this file that is added. This is basically what Bartender then sends to the printer. So it takes the definition of the label, combines it with the data. You see here 8001 and the license plate label and sends it. Yes. And with that, my short demo or demos are over, and back to the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Bostjan. So the first question is how Loftware knows which variable to be overridden from FNO values. Do we need to put placeholder in the label?
So it doesn't know anything. So in the label layout, we tell it which data to send. And then Loftware just has a definition of these are the variables. And then in the elements, in the text elements, you can bind them to the data. So so if this is what you meant with, do we need to put placeholder in the label? Yes, in the label you put the text. You've seen maybe that quantity have changed to the variable quantity.
So a nice label at runtime would just replace those placeholders with the actual values.
Yeah.
Next question is how to map the cloud printer to the local printer.
So local print, if you want to use specifically with Loftware, local printers, then there's a different component you install on-prem. But cloud printers are cloud printers, so they are connected directly to the cloud. These Zebras are connected directly to the cloud. There is no server that would have this as a local printer. If you want to use local printers, then there's a second part of our documentation that talks about how to connect via cloud triggers, which then pass the information to an on-prem, like a DRA equivalent. And this would be similar to what Bartender Cloud does as well. So there would be an on-prem equivalent to DRA, but from Loftware or from Bartender.
All right. Moving on to the next question here. Have you seen or believe it's possible to use Azure Application Proxy to connect to an on-prem Bartender? Or would something more specific like Azure API be needed?
So I think the biggest problem will be in the authentication to the Azure Application Proxy. I have not seen that working. I know it works with APIM. APIM is like the Swiss Army knife of these manipulations. For Azure Application Proxy, I'm not sure it would work.
All right. Next question is, when will this functionality be available? It is already available.
Yes.
Yes. Starting 34, right?
Yeah. Yes, it's been available for quite a while.
Yeah. All right. So I posted a short survey in the Q&A panel. We would love to hear your feedback on today's session. Thanks to our presenters and to you, our audience, for attending our Tech Talk today. We hope you have a great rest of the day ahead.